So today we're going to start a sermon series that has taken me about 20 years to prepare. In seminary, I was forced to preach a sermon on the life of Jacob for preaching class, Homiletics 102, I believe. And I had no idea what to do with Jacob. He is a terrible human being. Like, you wouldn't trust him to babysit your kids. Heaven help you if you got into a business deal with him, and the only thing worse than being a business partner with him would be to be related to the man. If you try to turn his story, this story is from Genesis, like chapter 25 and forward, into a moral lesson. If you try and turn the life of Jacob into a moral lesson, you come up with principles like calculated manipulation is the key to God's blessing, and bold faith requires bold lies. Or my personal favorite, creating healthy competition between your love interests is a good thing. It's not just nonsense, it's actually repulsive. You see, at times, the life of Jacob is repulsive. He is full of such mixed motives, bad will, selfish intent, that when his brother Esau wants to kill him, and you're reading through this story, and it gets to that point that he's so angry that he wants to kill him, you kind of hope that he does. Jacob is so deeply flawed. Like, why God loves him, why God chooses to make him a father of faith, it confounds reason. And yet, as you read through the story, God did love him. God did choose him. God did name his people and the promised land after him. God did make him a father of faith, and God did bless the whole world through him. In fact, God identified with him. God said, I am the God of Jacob. And maybe that's the point. So after wrestling with this text, with this guy named Jacob, with this God of Jacob for these past 20 years, I've come not only to appreciate, but to kind of relish the story of Jacob. Like, the very things that once repulsed me, they now compel me to share the story with you. The very things that once confounded me, they now comfort me. And I'm not sure where you're at in your relationship with God. Maybe you'll find this more confusing and repulsive than compelling and comforting. I don't want to put expectations on how this is going to strike you or what God's going to say to you in these stories, but I merely want to ask this of you as we head into this series, this life of Jacob. I want to ask that you would let God do his work, that you would let God speak for himself, that you would let God say things to you even if it's painful. All right? So a brief introduction is in order to this guy named Jacob. I don't want to over-explain things. I want the story itself. I want God to explain this. I want you to discover this as we share these stories. But a little bit of context might help here. Jacob is a father of faith. He comes from Abraham, the father of faith. So Abraham had kind of two famous sons. One was Ishmael, who became the father of of Islam today. But he also had Isaac, who was the father of Judaism and later Christianity. So Abraham is the father of faith in our world. And from Abraham came Isaac, and from Isaac came Jacob. Jacob will later get renamed Israel, which literally translates one who wrestles with God. And Israel will have 12 sons who will become the 12 tribes of Israel, who form what we know as the Jewish people and the Jewish nation to this day, out of which will come Jesus, the Messiah, and people who follow Jesus, like GVF. So all of this takes root in these stories, and all of this takes place sometime around 1700 BC. That is a long time ago, in the place called the ancient Near East. Now, in that context, Abraham, his grandpa, and Isaac, dad, are both nomadic tribal chieftains, and they are a Hebrew people. Hebrew, it means they come from the line of a guy named Eber, who is referenced in Genesis 10:21, and they probably speak some language that they picked up from this guy named Eber that is called Hebrew, which is like a proto-language to Hebrew. The text we're about to read is ancient. Ancient stuff here. The language has largely been updated to a Hebrew language that would have been spoken more in the time of Ezra, around 600 or 4 to 600 BC. But the stories, Even some of the words in this text, they're going to predate the Hebrew language itself. It is absolutely ancient. There's a lot more to say, but I just want to give that context as we get started. Genesis chapter 25 is where this story begins. Genesis chapter 25, starting in verse 19, and it starts like this. This is the account of Abraham's son Isaac. In Hebrew, this phrase, this is the account of, is toledot, and it marks something. It marks a new chapter in the story. It literally translates, this is the generation of, or the account of. It's kind of like a subject heading or a chapter heading for the book of Genesis. And this is the 8th time in the book of Genesis we came to Toledot, or this is the account of. So this is the 8th chapter, if you will. And this new story, this new chapter, is specifically an account of Abraham's son Isaac. And the emphasis here is on the son of Abraham. And if you've been reading along in the book of Genesis up to this point, you'll see that this 8th chapter in the book, the previous 7 chapters, were all about this expected son that would come. From Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, we've been expecting a son to come, a son of Eve, who would someday crush the head of the serpent, who would someday push back the chaos that is destroying us, that would somehow bring us back into relationship with God again. In Genesis chapter 12, later on in the story, God himself intervenes. He begins this work of redeeming a people for himself. He's going to heal what's broken in creation and our own souls, and he does it through a man named Abram, later called Abraham. God swears to Abram that he will bless him, and through a son of Abraham, he will ultimately bless the whole world. That's where healing will begin. That's how his recreation, his work of crushing the work of the serpent will ultimately end. How salvation, justice, healing, the deep, rich fullness of life that he's promised that we're created for, all of that will come through the promised son of Abraham. And then in chapters 12 through 24, the story unfolds. Abraham and Hagar have a son, but he's not the promised son. He's Ishmael. And this is, according to at least Muslim tradition, he is the father of Islam. But then miraculously, when Abraham and Sarah are very old, as good as dead, the author of Hebrews says, as good as dead, I'm guessing that's really, really old, Abraham and Sarah have a promised son, Isaac, and we pick up the story now with that heading in mind. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean from Padan Aram, and the sister of Laban, the Aramean. So at this point, everything's set. For the last 7 chapters, we've been waiting for this moment, for this promised son to come. And now we're ready for this. The only question, here's Isaac, the promised son of Abraham, and he's finally married to the right girl at the right time, and we're expecting them to have a baby, a promised son. So GVF has always leaned towards the young side. At one point, our average age of our congregation was like 9 years old, and I'm not joking. The largest cohort of our church has always been babies. So it's wonderful, it's awesome, it's chaotic. But at one point, there was this trend that started happening. Young couples would start coming to GVF. They would be married, no kids, and then after they attended for a year or two, they would move to Phoenixville and then start having babies, just baby after baby after baby. It became so common that young couples would start attending GVF, move to Phoenixville, have a baby, that on staff we started using this phrase. Whenever someone would move to Phoenixville, that became a nice way of saying that we were expecting them to have babies anytime soon. My point here is that Isaac is moving to Phoenixville. That's where this text is leading. Like, clearly, he's the promised son of Abraham. He just got married. Clearly, God has sworn that he's going to have a son who's going to then save the whole world someday through that son. That's what everyone's expecting when they get married. But we read in the very next verse, Isaac prayed to the Lord, literally begged to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. Now, I want you to feel this. Isaac and Rebekah do everything right. Everything. Isaac plays by the rules. He goes to church, marries a Christian girl. His life up to this point is so good that it's downright boring. Like, there's just nothing to say because he does everything right. And everything in the text has led us to expect them to have a baby. God swore to give them a baby. Creation itself is waiting for the birth of the promised son, but the text says, but she was barren. God promised, but she was barren. So I've walked with a number of parents, number of families who can't have children. And it is a special kind of helplessness. Like, you know intellectually that it's beyond your control, but something in you wants to blame someone. You want to blame yourself. You want to blame your spouse. You want to blame God. You want to blame someone. And that dissonance, that helplessness, that teaches us something about the promise of God, about this life with God in this text, about the way in which God works. And I want you to follow this. They, Isaac and Rebekah, in this text, they cannot bring about the promises of God by being good or by playing by the rules. They cannot expect God to act on their timeline. They cannot save the world by themselves. They cannot bring about the life that God has promised. They must wait. They must pray. That's literally all they can do at this point. Now, it's easy to read right over this because the very next line says, and the Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. So one might be tempted to smooth this over and say, so when I feel helpless, when I can't experience the promises of God, I just need to pray, and God will answer that prayer, and that is true. But when we go down to verse 26, it reads, Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth. He was 40 when they got married. He was 60 when they had a baby. For 20 years, Isaac waited. For 20 years, Isaac prayed. 20 years. So, we all face seasons of helplessness. When we feel powerless to make anything happen. And Isaac's story, from the beginning, that is going to become Jacob's story, Isaac's story reminds us that life is not ultimately within our control. To be born or to be born again, physical life and spiritual life, is not something you can cause or create. Life can only be received as a gift. We cannot bring about the promises of God by being good or by playing by the rules. We cannot expect God to act on our timeline. We cannot save the world, and we cannot bring about the life that God has promised. Now, some of us numb ourselves to this reality. Some of us rail against this. Some of us are driven to despair, but some find a way to receive life as gift, to live in that helplessness as an act of faith and gratitude. Some find a way to relax and trust God with this life. And some, like Jacob, and like most of us, we will only let go of control after God wrestles us into submission. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So in verse 22, Isaac prays, Rebekah gets pregnant, and we read, the babies jostled each other within her, and she said, why is this happening to me? The text here, it's a little nice, the English version. This pregnancy is violent. The word translated jostled literally means to crush or destroy. It's a warfare language. And it literally, this whole text can be translated like this. The baby struggled inside her, and she said, why this I? Like, she can't even complete her thought or sentence. She's in so much pain. Something's happening in her that she so can't explain, and she's crushed by this. So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. So Rebekah, you're going to have twins. What's happening in your womb is only going to get worse when they come out. That's what God says to her. Jacob, who would be the father of the Israelites, and Esau, who would be the father of the Edomites, 2 nations, would come out. And for generations to come, these brothers would form nations that would jostle for generations to come. Now, before we move on, I want you to see 2 things in this text. One is that this phrase, the older will serve the younger, I'm going to nerd out for a second. Just follow me just for a second here. The word older there is a hapax legomena. you can throw that away. But what that means is it's said one time. It's only used one time in ancient Hebrew that we know of. And this is it. In this text, we find this word. And here's the interesting part. The only other known occurrence of this word is an Akkadian cognate from 1500 BC. What's my point? This text is ancient. Like, these stories have been challenging, informing, and instructing, and shaping the people of God for at least 3,500 years. So when I went to seminary, I went through a phase where I refused to read any books that were less than 500 years old. My argument was there are so many new books coming out, most of which were trash. I couldn't possibly sort through them all. I figured that if a book had been around at least 500 years, I could trust that it was something worth reading. My point on this is something worth reading. So number one, this text is ancient. Number two, I want you to see this in this text. Sometimes having your prayers answered is a lot harder than not having your prayers answered. Now, you might think that God not answering your prayers is unbearably painful. You might think that your struggles in life come from God not answering your prayers, but Rebecca is here to tell us sometimes unbearable pain and intense struggle is a sign that God is in fact answering your prayers. Verse 24. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau, or hairy. That's kind of what Esau sounds like in Hebrew. So this kid is red. The word here could also be translated ruddy. It's the same word that was used to describe King David when he was just like a shepherd boy, and he was super good looking. He was attractive, so they called him ruddy. Esau here is going to grow up to be one good looking dude, right? He's going to be good looking and extremely hairy. Somehow those did not conflict at that time. Now, while it's true that Esau is often portrayed in like this animal-like way in the text, I don't want you to think of Wolfman. I want you to think of Tom Selleck, 1980s, right? This is the picture of Esau that we get in the text. Verse 26. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob, or sounds like heel in Hebrew. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. So this name Jacob, Yaakov, sounds like Akub, which literally means to seize someone by the heel, or figuratively means to go behind someone's back or to betray them. Both meanings apply to this guy named Jacob. So drink this in. In Jacob, the promises of God are literally born in pain and hardship. Life with God is literally born in a struggle, in a combat, in like a wrestling match. Now, I don't want to over-spiritualize this, but don't you think it's interesting that Jacob, the man who would later become named Israel, the one who wrestles with God, who would become the father of God's people, for whom God's people and the promised land would be named, from whom the Messiah would come, that Jacob, this Jacob, would literally be named for struggle. His life, his parents, his relationship with his brother, his marriages, plural, his in-laws, his work, his relationship with God, and even his birth would be indelibly marked with struggle, with conflict, with tension, with fighting. It almost makes me want to suggest that maybe struggle is not irregular. Maybe struggle is to be expected in life with God. That maybe you know you've encountered the promises of God when you feel helpless. That maybe the blessings of God might be painful. That entering life with God might mean entering into a great struggle. That becoming a church where life transformation is normal might look like coming to a point of complete helplessness, questioning why God, and entering into a great struggle. The boys grew up, and Esau, hairy, became a skillful hunter and a man of the open country, while Jacob, the heel, became a quiet man, literally a perfect man, staying among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Do you get the picture here? The boys could not be more different, and mom and dad, they unapologetically play favorites here. So Harry comes out of the womb shaving and likes to kill things with his bare hands, and Isaac's like, that's my boy. And then Jacob the heel, he's a perfect little boy. He's a mama's boy, loves to stay among the tents. Couldn't be more different. So let's we obviously see this from like a personality difference or from like a strength difference, but let's put this in the ancient Near Eastern context. To know the context is to know how this story is supposed to go when we read these lines. So Esau, he is favored by dad, and he is the firstborn in this context. In our day, being firstborn means that you have a chip on your shoulder because your younger brother you didn't get to drive to the mall with your friends until you were 18, but your younger brother got to do that as soon as he got his license or something like that, right? That's what it means to be firstborn. Back then, it was actually a big deal. There's a technical term for this, and this won't be on the exam, but it's primogeniture. This refers to the ancient custom of the firstborn taking over leadership, responsibility, ownership for the family. So, remember, this is a tribal culture. Isaac is not just dad, he's the tribal chieftain. His household includes more than 400 servants. He oversees a multi-million-dollar business. He is the president, the general, the judge, the CEO, the head of the church. In their tribe, he functions as prophet, priest, and king. It's a huge role to fill. And according to the ancient custom of primogeniture, the firstborn son receives the mantle of authority, the responsibility when the father dies. So from birth, everything was on Esau's side. He was firstborn. Dad preferred him. He was good looking and powerful. Everything preferred Esau. Jacob, in contrast, had everything against him. He's the second-born mama's boy. Like the guys like him, they just don't get ahead in the Middle Bronze Age. It doesn't happen. So everything is in favor of Esau, and everything is against Jacob, except God chose Jacob. Now this text, if it's going to mean anything in our lives, we need to feel the scandal of what's about to take place. So the long-held customs are going to be shattered. The second-born will topple the firstborn. The hierarchy of family and gender is going to be inverted. The female will defeat the male. Human strength will be mocked because weakness will overcome power. And God's love is going to prove to be truly unconditional. Like not conditioned by how good we look, or how strong we are, or how powerful we are, or how well-liked we are. None of that seems to matter to God. A sinful, manipulative heel of a man is going to be chosen by God, is going to be loved by God, is going to be chosen to represent him to the whole world. In the words of Romans chapter 9, it does not therefore depend on human desire or effort, but on God's mercy alone. And that is the scandal of God's grace. God does not choose the people we would choose. He loves sinners. He loves those who don't deserve it. He loves those who the world passes over. He chooses to love people like us. Now, one might think that being chosen by God and unconditionally loved by God might make one want to live in a way that pleases God, but then we remember we're talking about Jacob here. Verse 29. When Jacob was cooking some stew, this is a Hebrew phrase that can mean literally cooking some stew, but it can also mean like cooking up a plan or plotting or cooking up some trouble. When Jacob was cooking up some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." So we as a family have started eating dinner at 4 p.m. Ridiculous, I know. But we've learned. When our kids get home from school, they are miserable human beings. They hate life and find sadistic ways to torture one another and us until they eat dinner. And when they eat dinner, it's like you flip a switch in them. It's like the party switch is flipped on, and suddenly they're laughing and dancing around and loving each other. It's just wonderful. So Esau here, he is like a middle school student at 4 p.m. He even sounds like it. His words literally read, "Now let me devour ha-adam, ha-adam," that red stuff, that red stuff. And the text goes on to explain that's why he's also called Edom, or red. Now Esau is admittedly uncouth in the way he's requesting the food here, but let me again explain our context. This is a hospitality culture. The ancient Near East in general was a hospitality culture. In the ancient Near East, hospitality was considered the great virtue. Like your character was revealed by your hospitality. So when a stranger shows up hungry or needing a place to stay, you take them in, period. Like this still exists in parts of the world today. Earlier in the text in Genesis, we see that Abraham and Lot are great men of God. And how do we know that? Because when three random strangers show up, Abraham offers a feast for them, and Lot will do anything to protect them. Right? Hospitality is critical in this culture. Now Esau, he might look like an animal and might be talking like an animal right now, but surely in this hospitality culture, Jacob would not be such a heel as to let his own brother starve to death. That would just mean he's a monster. But what do we read? Jacob replied, "First, sell me your birthright." Now this is ridiculous. It's like we're at dinner and you're like, "Hey, will you pass me the salt?" And I'm like, "Sure, first, sell me your family." Like, it's just ridiculous. It makes no sense. So among these ancient tribal people, your birthright was everything. As we already talked about, he was the firstborn son. Esau would receive a double portion of the inheritance. He would rule over the family. He would be the next tribal chieftain. He would be the prophet, priest, and king. It's his birthright, but not just that. He's the great grandson of Abraham, which meant that for him, the birthright was the very promises of God, that God swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and now to Jacob, that through them, one would come who would bless the whole world. So here's the real question. Jacob just asked you, Esau, if you would like to give up your identity, your future, your honor, the very promises of God, for a bowl of red stew. Verse 32. "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew, and it literally reads, "And he ate, and he drank, and he stood up, and he walked away." So Esau despised his birthright. Jacob is the one who gets to change the world. Jacob is the one who gets listed among the greats in Hebrews chapter 11, that great hall of faith. Jacob gets to be eternally honored as the father of God's people. It is through Jacob that the Messiah would come. Esau, on the other hand, got a bowl of lentil stew. Esau traded his identity, his honor, his future, and the very promises of God for some bread and some red stuff. The author of Hebrews camps out on this and warns us in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 16. "See that no one is sexually immoral or godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance as the oldest son." The point seems pretty clear. Don't be like Esau. Like, don't trade in your identity, your future, the promises of God for cheap pleasures, for empty things, for things that won't leave you satisfied, for a bowl of lentil stew. Don't be like Esau. Now, you could preach a whole sermon on this. In fact, I have. It's an important message. But in the same breath that we say, don't be like Esau, we also have to say, Jacob is a heel. Like, he's a terrible human being in this passage. He shows no faith in God. He shows no goodwill towards his brother. He shows no hospitality, no sign of virtue, not even a sense that he might feel bad about what he's doing. Rather, he demonstrates a Machiavellian willingness to exploit his own brother for his own self-interest. He is calculating and callous. It's like Jacob has been studying his brother, watching for weaknesses, waiting for the right moment, and rehearsing his lines. The whole thing. It's terrible. It's inexcusable. Perhaps the only redeeming quality in this passage that we see in Jacob is that he wants the birthright. He wants the promises of God. even if he's doing it all wrong, even if he has horrible motives, even if he is exploitive and selfish and rude in the process, he wants the promises of God, and Esau doesn't. Now, if you're waiting for a simple moral lesson from this passage, you better focus on Esau. Don't be like Esau. But Jacob, the father of faith, he does not fit comfortably into our modern American sermons. He does not fit comfortably into our modern American lives. And maybe, could I suggest, that's the point. Jacob disabuses us of any sense that we can make ourselves righteous or that we should even be trying to. He mocks us for thinking that God's love could possibly be earned. He offends anyone who thinks that personal righteousness is a prerequisite for a personal relationship with God, and he overturns our assumptions about what it means to be transformed by God. So the God of Jacob, he does not woo us. He does not discipline us or even preach us into transformation. That's not how he works. The God of Jacob, he wrestles us into transformation. In Jacob, the life of faith appears less like God gently holding you while you sing, "I surrender all to him," and more like God pressing you into submission hold until you tap out or pass out. Jacob forces us to question our assumptions about life with God, about how this God of Jacob works, about how he answers prayers, about who he loves, and about what life transformation actually looks and feels like. And in that spirit, I don't want to so much give you practical things. Jacob is not an example to follow. More, I want to give you some questions that maybe will disrupt, maybe change the way you imagine who God is, the way life should work out for you. I want to give you, in that spirit, I want to close with a few questions and one quick assignment. Here's the questions I want you to seriously answer this week. Number 1, why do you think God loves you? Do you really believe that God loves you unconditionally, without condition? Or do you think he only loves you for the things you do or have or your position or power? Or do you think that God couldn't love you? Number 2, what do you think it would look like for the God of Jacob to bless you? For Rebecca, it looked terrible, painful, harsh. For Jacob, it looked pretty brutal. What do you think it would look like for you? Number 3, what might it feel like if God answered your prayers, like your deepest prayers? What would that actually look and feel like? Number 4, what do you think God might be doing through your struggles, in your struggles? And number 5, the last one, what would it take for God to really transform your life, to form you from the inside out, to turn you into the kind of person who receives life as gift, who lives not in fear, manipulation, or shame or lust, but in love and peace and joy? Like, what would it take for God to really transform your life? Now, those are the questions I want you to ask. Now, here's the assignment. I want you to answer these one by one. Like, why do you think God loves you? What would it look like for God to bless you? What might it feel like for God to answer your prayers? What do you think God's doing in your struggles? What does it look like? What might it look and feel like to really be transformed by God? I'm going to answer these, and then I want you to sit and pray before God in this text, and I want you to ask God to reveal how he feels about your answers, and whether your answers reflect the God who is and the God who is revealed in this text. That's your assignment, and then we'll pick up Jacob's story. See you next week.